I'm just a volunteer. Paul will be telling you about ANTaR. But I'd like to just say that Paul Wright is the National Director of the nationwide ANTaR.
I just bring Sheila along to give me the nice intros. Sheila is underselling her just a volunteer status. She's part of the ANTaR family and does a lot of great work for us, which I'll cover in this time. Well, if it's okay, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about ANTaR, and then the work that we're concentrating on at the moment, a little bit about sort of, I guess, the political environment in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space. But if there's any questions at any point as I'm rattling on, please don't hesitate to pipe up and ask or seek clarification on anything. But just to start, a little bit about myself. I'm a white fella. I was born on Ngunnawal country down in Canberra. I'm a Canberra boy. I grew up up in Tamworth for my primary schooling years, and I've lived in Sydney for about 8 years. So work on Gadigal country, but live on Darug country out in the northwest of Sydney. I live in a place called Riverston out near Windsor, for those that know it, and we've been out here for a couple of years. Growing up in Canberra, my dad actually started working for the predecessor to ATSIC, those that remember the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was around for about 15 years between 1990 and 2005. Yeah, Dad worked basically most of his career was working in and around the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bureaucracies, the predecessor to ATSIC, and then ATSIC, and then Indigenous Business Australia. So we had a lot of, through Dad's sort of professional connections, had a lot of family ties to different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in New South Wales. And I had a really positive experience as a kid with friends, close family friends that we'd made through Dad's work. I guess as you grow up and you lose a bit of your naivety, you realise that the impression or the views, the understandings and the connections that you have with, that I had with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't necessarily shared by everybody. And that was a bit of a reverse kind of wake up call. But I ended up studying at the University of Canberra and then ANU. I did politics and international relations. I became a faithful Canberra public servant, having a bit of a career in the Department of Immigration. And it was interesting, Phil, to note some of the areas of focus and advocacy that this group's interested in. I used to run one of the humanitarian programs at the Department of Immigration and did a lot of migration management capacity building. And had a real interest in that area, but continue to have, as we all do, a broader, again, because of my family connections, an abiding interest and kept an eye on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, and Dad continued to work in that space. But I never anticipated or pursued a career in this area. My wife ended up getting into med school up here in Sydney, so we moved to Sydney for her med school. I left the public service. This is around 2013. And I was, as you can imagine, quite happy to leave the Department of Immigration at that time. It was just starting to get quite nasty, to be frank, some of the policies of our government at that time, and they've continued, sadly. And that's not a partisan comment. We know that the Labor government back in the 90s was under Paul Keating, was the one that introduced mandatory detention. So we've only just seen fluctuations in the intensity of that kind of treatment of asylum seekers and migrants. But that's another topic which I can come back and rattle on for another time. But coming up here, I ended up working at the College of Physicians and ended up managing both the asylum seeker policies and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policies for that college, and was the proxy for the college on the Close the Gap campaign, which I'm sure you've all heard about. Now, the campaign was started by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the time, back in 2005, Tom Calma. and had been auspiced by the Human Rights Commission ever since. And it was really calling out the culmination of the 200 plus years of colonisation and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which at the time meant that there was nearly 2 decades in life expectancy gap between non-Indigenous Australians like myself and First Nations peoples, and all of the other social determinants of health statistics that went along with that. So I got quite involved in the campaign as a proxy for that member organisation. And then when the executive officer that ran that campaign moved on, I put my hand up to come over to the Human Rights Commission and become the executive officer for that campaign, and was really glad to get that job. So I ended up running the Close the Gap campaign and working with very senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health leadership around the country for 2 or 3 years. And in that role, we were always greatly supported by the organisation ANTaR, which I now head up, as Sheila noted. So ANTaR, it's sort of the artist formerly known as the Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. And ANTaR has been around for about 23 years now. And it was, do most of us know of ANTaR or have had some involvement? I'm sure some have. There's a few nods there. So you might, if you don't know ANTaR, the name, you might have seen our fairly famous Sea of Hands pop up at schools and at council festivals and the like over the last couple of decades as our abiding symbol of reconciliation. So back in '97, we had the John Howard coalition government. It was a couple of years in. We'd had about 8 years or 6 or 7 years of after Mabo and native title legislation. And then there was the Wick High Court decision that I'm sure some of us would remember the politics of that time. And that High Court decision was the impetus for the Howard government to try and water down the newly won native title legislation framework with its Wick 10-point plan. And what happened was a whole heap of non-Indigenous Australians joining with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians took to the streets and started protesting. It was a real protest movement, grassroots movement to resist the watering down of native title legislation and what had been won with Mabo and the High Court decisions from that time. And ANTaR, this Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, really grew as out of that time. And in '97, there was a collection of Australians that hired out a couple of big buses and drove around Australia with these corflute plastic hands in the colours of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, doing these huge installations in Broome, Alice Springs, Uluru, I should say, and in Canberra, amongst other places. Bondi Beach, some might remember the big installation in Bondi Beach at that time. And these ANTaR groups across the states and territories, and then there was a national body that was formed in those early years to really formalise and continue at an organised national level advocacy for native title, reconciliation, and a whole heap of other priority issues determined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that organisation had continued to evolve for the last, two decades plus. They were there when the Close the Gap campaign was formed in 2005. They were an original member and actually helped seed the idea for Close the Gap along with Tom Calmer. ANTaR had gone on in the following years to help form the Change the Record campaign, which is the key Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social justice campaign around justice. So incarceration rates, the ridiculously high incarceration rates for women, children, youth detention, and men around the country. So ANTaR's been at the forefront of those social justice campaigns over the last couple of decades. And when I was running the Close the Gap campaign, the one organisation that was always there to support us was ANTAR. So when the vacancy for the national director role came up, I put my hand up for that job as well, and joined ANTAR as its national director in April 2018. So it's been just a little over 2 years since I've been running with ANTAR, running ANTAR at the national level. And it's been an exciting couple of years, although the politics, well, I guess there's no easy time for the politics, but after now 7 going on to 8 years of this coalition series of governments, it has been politically a difficult time for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. I talked a little bit about my personal connection to ATSIC. It was the first national bureaucracy that was really the embodiment of self-determination, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples ran that organisation, that federal government department, and it had the administrative and representative arms to it. But the Howard government abolished that department and the self-determining work that it had conducted for that previous 15 years, and we've had nothing in its place. So since 2005, that is. So the work that ANTAR does to support the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in the peak organisations that they run has been really critical. So our priorities for the last couple of years, certainly since I've been with the organisation, has been to continue our support for those social justice campaigns, particularly Close the Gap and the Change the Record campaign, which we've helped form. I also sit on the board of Just Reinvest New South Wales. So has anyone heard of the concept of justice reinvestment? No? Some might have. So just in short, the concept of justice reinvestment, it was sort of started in the US, particularly in some of those more conservative southern states, but it's the idea that if you invest in communities and the communities are given the power to invest in themselves, you spend that money rather than spending it on building new prisons or, continuing to have to fund the ridiculously high incarceration rates with your existing prisons. So we'd all much rather spend money on our communities and the health of our communities than spending it on locking up people, wouldn't we? So Just Reinvest New South Wales, working very closely with the community up in Bourke, the Aboriginal community up in Bourke in northern New South Wales. They really piloted justice reinvestment in Australia. And I don't know whether I can, maybe through yourself, Phil, can flick around a number of articles and some links to the website for justice reinvestment. But the project up there was the Maranooka project, and it was about the Aboriginal community up there really driving a justice reinvestment program. They worked very closely with the local council, with the New South Wales state government, with the police up there. There was news articles about 6-7 years ago about Bourke being one of the most dangerous places on earth in terms of crime rates, the dysfunction with the relationship with the police up there. About a third of the population of 3,500 is Aboriginal. And in 6 years since the Aboriginal leadership up there, the community have adopted a justice reinvestment project. Things have completely turned around. And now the Maranooka program or project is the exemplar for justice reinvestment in New South Wales. So I'm really proud as the ANTAR National Director to sit on the board of Just Reinvest New South Wales and to be a supporter of that program. It's really exciting, and now we're seeing communities, Aboriginal communities around New South Wales, exploring how they can take on or adopt for themselves justice reinvestment programs for themselves. So Moree in northern New South Wales, Lismore, Cowra in the southwest, Mount Druitt here in Western Sydney, are all their Aboriginal communities are exploring how they can also take on justice reinvestment for themselves, because they just don't want to see their kids in youth incarceration, and they don't want to see the recidivism that we see because there's no programs of support and there's no hope. And we're seeing in Burke that can be turned around when you invest in the Aboriginal community themselves, and when they have control over how those programs are determined and delivered. So it's been really exciting. The other big thing that we've really taken on, maybe before I go on, I want to talk a bit about, for 5 minutes, if that's okay, Phil, about our treaty work. But is there any questions about any of that at this point? Or Sheila, anything that you think I've forgotten that I should mention? You're on mute, Sheila.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. There's certainly treaty work. There's, no. Questions from others?
Yeah, was there any questions at this point before I continue?
This is Claire. I just think that it's a shame this hasn't, I haven't really heard much about this, and it's such a positive story. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Well, and I'll probably get to this at the end, but one of the reasons why Sheila has been reaching out to groups like yourselves around New South Wales is that we want to get far better at communicating what's going on. And we want it to be a two-way street, that we're actually hearing from the ANTaR and reconciliation groups and social justice groups around Sydney and New South Wales, and hearing what you guys are doing so that we can be a platform for communication on all that work. So I might pass to Sheila to talk a little bit about that right at the end, if that's all right. But is there a question there from...
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, do you guys have a social media account or anything?
Yeah, we do. We've got, I hope, a reasonably prominent Facebook page, and we also are on Twitter, and one of our people here at ANTaR, Phaedra, she's also really reinvigorated our Instagram account, which isn't my forte, I have to admit, or Twitter. So I leave that to her and concentrate on Facebook. But we try and share everything that we're doing, and also share a lot of the work that's going on through those channels.
Perhaps, an outcome from this meeting is that Paul, you or me or someone, get a number of all those links to web, face, all the social media stuff that we've got.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for you people to, put it out to all of your networks.
Yeah. Can I ask you a quick question? Would it be possible to get you to speak at my Rotary Club of the Upper Northern Beaches via Zoom in the next couple of weeks?
I'd be happy to tomorrow. No problem. Yeah.
Great.
Sounds great.
So I might just keep going to talk a little specifically about our treaty work at the moment. The reason why we don't go by the full, we're kind of the artist formerly known as, we just go by ANTaR these days, or have done for a number of years, is as you can gather, native title and reconciliation are only parts of the myriad of social justice work and advocacy that we do. And hopefully it's been self-evident in how I've been describing the work, but we are non-Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians coming together. We're not an Aboriginal peak organisation, although our board is about 50-50 in terms of non-Indigenous Australians and First Nations peoples on the board. But we don't claim to be a peak organisation. It's really the coming together, hence our symbol of the hands. But I say that because everything that we say and do is at the direction of, or following the lead of, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we get that direction and those priorities through our partnership with them on those social justice campaigns, and in working very closely with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations in health and in justice and in native title and in a whole range of areas. So we don't sort of come up with what the priorities are ourselves. We really follow the direction of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. And without their leadership, we certainly don't speak for them, but we look to amplify their messages and their priorities. So with treaty, as you can all imagine, treaty's been part of the conversation for a long time now. It really started to come to prominence around the bicentenary, 1988, the bicentenary of the First Fleet and colonisation. and I was just a schoolboy up in Tamworth, East Tamworth Primary School in the bicentenary. And I think I lost my medallion coin that we were given at school at the time. I don't know if anyone ever received one of those. But that same year, I'm sure you're all familiar with the history. Bob Hawke was our Prime Minister. Galarrwuy Yunupingu, that the famous Yolngu leader from the top end, East Arnhem Land, he presented on behalf of the Territory Land Councils the Burunga Statement to Bob Hawke at the Burunga Festival that year. And in it, it was a call for the federal government to enter into treaties with First Nations peoples around Australia. And Australia today is the only former British colony, Commonwealth country that hasn't entered into treaties with the First Nations people. So the United States has, and that I'm not making a comment at this stage about the quality or value necessary of those treaties, but the United States has a series of treaties with its First Nations. Canada, we obviously are very familiar here with New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi in Aotearoa, which was in 1956, I think. Don't quote me on that, but in the 1950s, I think it was negotiated with the Maori tribes at that time, and that treaty process is still in place. So we're the only country or only former British colony that's never entered into a treaty with First Nations peoples. So in 1988, the Burunga Statement was a real, it was the birth, I guess, of the modern challenge that we needed to address that. And that we, I guess, being the late adopters, if and when, and it should be a matter of time now, that we can improve on the treaty experiences of other countries. So while we were certainly lax in being so late to enter into treaty, we can certainly do it better because we can learn from the international experiences of First Nations in those other countries that I've mentioned. So we entered into, and actually Sheila, just to give some credit here, Sheila's been working on some of our reconciliation pages on our website, and we'll share this information with you via email a little bit later. But in it, you reminded me, Sheila, that in the 1990s was really that decade of reconciliation. There was a real focus, starting with the Hawke and Keating governments, around reconciliation. We know of leaders like the Dodson brothers, and particularly Pat Dodson, really leading that conversation around reconciliation and truth-telling. And treaty was part of that conversation. There was a real revival in thinking about what treaty would look like and pushing for treaty to be part of the consideration. Fast forward to the last 4 years or so. Well, actually the last decade and 2 decades, since 2000, we had sort of the culmination of that decade of reconciliation. We had the Bridge Walk, some would remember, in Sydney, Corroboree 2000. In the 2 decades since, we've had process after process led by the federal government to find a way to have constitutional recognition of First Nations people. So righting the wrongs of 1901 and really, I guess, retrofitting recognition. And now and since that time, there's been a real conversation or battle between how much of it is symbolic recognition and how much of it is real constitutional reform. And treaty has become more and more prominently part of that conversation and that mix. And where our federal government has been very reluctant to talk treaty for its own reasons, what we've seen is at the state and territory government level, there's been far more willingness to explore treaty as a way of, at the jurisdictional level, trying to right some of those wrongs and taking us to that next step. So most prominently in Victoria, the Andrews government, about, I think in the first couple of years, it's been around about 6 years now. They made some very strong commitments about entering into treaty or treaties with the First Nations peoples of Victoria. Last year, after what was effectively a 5-year process of engagement with First Nations peoples in Victoria, they had the historic election of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and that assembly will go on to negotiate the framework for future negotiations of treaties between the government and First Nations down in Victoria. So Mick Dodson, who's now up in the Northern Territory, is a Yawuru man from northwestern Australia. He's famously said that treaty negotiation is a decades-long process. So we're under no false illusions about just how long it is to sort of negotiate treaty and to get it right. But Victoria is 5 or 6 years down that path and of making real historic strides. And since Victoria, I guess, has lifted its collective head above the parapet, we've seen well, they're not formal treaty processes, but in Western Australia there was under the former Liberal coalition government, just to show it's not necessarily a Labor left thing. We had the negotiation of the Noongar settlement, which some would argue was the first significant treaty negotiated in Australia with the Noongar Nation and the West Australian government. We've had South Australia, the former Labor government, enter into treaty negotiations with several of the First Nations in South Australia, and that came to a halt with the election of the Marshall coalition government a couple of years ago. We've had in Queensland the Tracks to Treaty introduced by the Palaszczuk government, and that's been a couple of 18-month process led by senior First Nations woman Jackie Huggins, who some of us might know, and subject to who wins the Queensland election later this year, if it is a Labor government, they'll continue to pursue a treaty conversation and future negotiations with the First Nations up in Queensland. And then Mick Dodson, who I mentioned, was appointed by the Northern Territory government last year as the Northern Territory Treaties Commissioner to explore a pathway to treaties with the First Nations of the Northern Territory. So it's been really exciting. In the last 5 or 6 years, despite the intransigence of our federal government and the real partisan nature of the politics across the board, really, but we can see it playing out in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs at the Commonwealth level. Our states and territories have been really leading the conversation around treaty. And the great thing is, particularly for the states, they don't have to wait for our federal government to get its act together around the constitutional issues and around a treaty conversation. And I should mention, I didn't mention it, on Tuesday this coming week, we're actually entering into National Reconciliation Week. On Tuesday, it will be the 3-year anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And when I talked about, 2 decades since 2000 of federal government processes to try and find a way through the political impasse around constitutional recognition and constitutional reform, the last federally instigated process through the Referendum Council, it culminated in a 12-month process of engagement with First Nations around the country, where they, instead of just having, a political conversation in Canberra around what constitutional engagement should look like, constitutional reform should look like, they actually went to Aboriginal people and asked them systematically around the country. And then they brought representatives from all of those engagement processes to Uluru in May 2017. And rather than sort of talking about, well, we'll adjust section 51 this way and section 127, although that might have been one of the ones that's already been adjusted. But instead of having a conversation about the technical changes to the Constitution and those sections that deal with the race powers, historically, the Uluru Statement, which was this one-page statement, which I'm sure we've all seen, but if not, we'll certainly send links around to, was a paradigm shift, because it went away from the technical constitutional reform to three things that they asked for. One, they asked that there be a voice enshrined in the Constitution for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It wasn't an organ of Parliament, but a voice to Parliament that would speak for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the issues that impacted them. And then the other two things were wrapped up in a Makarrata Commission, which is a Yolngu word meaning coming together after conflict. And that Makarrata Commission was to lead a process around truth-telling and around treaty. So 3 years it's been since that Uluru Statement this Tuesday. And I guess those state and territory processes have really continued to carry the torch around treaty. And whenever you're talking treaty, you have to talk about truth-telling at the same time. And whether it's voice first at a national level, or whether it's building from the ground up at the states and territories, and at a nation-to-nation level, voices that then go on one day to form a national voice that is constitutionally enshrined, however it works, I think the genie's out of the bottle. And, you know, it's organisations like ANTaR at a national level, our state and territory affiliates, Reconciliation Australia, and all of the other social justice groups that are really picking up these issues and continuing to discuss them and speak with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about these priorities. It's really keeping that conversation alive. And initially, the Commonwealth government had rejected out of hand. I think the then Turnbull government pretty much straight away rejected the three calls in that Uluru Statement. But over time, they've walked back. You know, we've now got the Morrison government. It's hard to keep track of which Prime Minister we have from day to day, but we've had Morrison now for, I think, about 18 months or thereabouts, which is...
just over a year.
Yeah, well, it's been a year since he's been re-elected, that's for sure. I think they've seen that there is a groundswell that non-Indigenous Australians are well ahead of them when it comes to recognition, when it comes to constitutional reform, and we're not afraid of there being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice constitutionally enshrined. You know, we're not afraid because we've lived in a society where native title and the celebration of the High Court decision in 1992 and Edi Koi Koi Mabo is just part of our society now, and we're not afraid. We know that our society moves on and we're evolving, and I think our communities at large are well ahead of the political conversation that's happening in Canberra. So that gives me hope. And that's kind of the work and the concentration that we've been bringing to this. So for ANTaR specifically, and I've probably gone well over the 25 minutes I promised, Phil. But just to finish, we about 18 months ago, we with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners, particularly the National Native Title Council, which is the peak organisation for native title, and also the University of Melbourne, we decided to put on a national treaty summit to really elevate the national conversation around treaty, to bring the international experiences around treaty to Australia to have that conversation, and also to really highlight what's been happening at the states and territories. So we were all scheduled to hold our summit, National Treaty Summit, in Melbourne in April this year. There was a little thing called the coronavirus that seemed to overtake our best laid plans. And so we had to postpone about 4 weeks before we were due to hold the summit, which obviously was a shame, but we're still very committed to holding that National Treaty Summit. We had all the senior Aboriginal leadership from around the country. It all signed up to speak. We had people coming from all around the country to hear and to discuss. And so we're all very much committed to putting on that treaty summit in 2021. So we're just working through the logistics to make sure that we've got a plan in place that in whatever shape or form we need to be, that we can have that conversation and carry on that work. So we're really proud of the work that we've been doing. And I guess this is our appeal for your support in talking about it, sharing the information, sharing what work that we're doing. And just to wrap up here, Sheila, one of the ideas that we had was to really start to tie together a lot of those community-based groups, particularly around New South Wales to start with. And so we tasked Sheila up with being our point person and going around and trying to reach out to all of the old ANTaR community groups and reconciliation groups and organisations like yourselves to see if there's interest in coming together in a much more formalised way where we can have that two-way conversation and share what everybody's doing. So that's why we're catching up with you all today. And I'll stop there, Phil, because like I said, I can just keep going. But I'm sure you either have questions or want to talk about other things. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Paul. No, certainly time-wise, really today is devoted to this issue. And just speaking for myself, I haven't kept up with progress in this area. The projects that you mentioned that Claire commented on, I was not aware of that. That sounds like really good news. Always at the bottom of this, I have in mind the question: what do I do in concert with other people? So that's being aware of what's happening is step one. And then if there's some specific action that needs to be taken, I can see what you're saying. First of all is that, more people should know the progress that has been made, perhaps understand a little bit better the statement from the heart and so on. But further from that, what progress has been made in terms of the treaty, and then what does the ordinary person in the pew do, in response? Because it's good to hear this news. One of the reactions that I find that ordinary people hear or experience is some sort of sense of guilt at times. It's another big issue that it's an injustice issue. I think that having a sense of what I can do in concert with others, that other people are doing the same thing, that gives people strength and it gives them hope, and says to them that this is worthwhile me doing. I suppose that's almost a question, isn't it? It's what do we do from here? Sorry, I can see a hands up there.
I just wanted to extend on what you said. So the focus of that question is what can we do? So from the perspective of formulating social movements and things like that, which this is supposed to create or support, what legislation do you think is most necessary and most impactful to move Australia's relationship with the Indigenous people of Australia into the future? And also, I'd be interested to know what you think, what problems and challenges are most impactful for young Indigenous people in the current era.
Yeah, okay.
You want about another couple of hours for that answer?
So starting with Phil, we'll come up with, actually, for National Reconciliation Week, we've actually pulled together a list of things that people can do to show their support and to be sharing information, and we'll pass on that information through you, Phil, to share with the group.
Okay.
And like you said, part of it is just starting with being aware, and for organisations like ANTaR, a big way to help is actually just to disseminate the information, to be sharing, these issues, because we just want more people to be aware. And a lot of the political change comes from what we describe as truth telling. It's actually having a better understanding of what actually is the truth behind our shared history since 1788. and before 1788, being a lot more aware of what Australia's history was like and peoples were like before colonisation, and to be aware of what the issues are now. You mentioned the word guilt, and I think a lot of the negative kind of responses to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs really come from guilt. And I'm saying this as a white fella, but for me, guilt is kind of and it's completely understandable to have those feelings, but it's actually a wasted emotion or energy, when really it should be redirected into, without sounding too corny, into love. Because we have love and we are passionate about social justice and about doing the right thing. That's a much more positive and proactive kind of investment. So guilt isn't necessary. I don't think our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander fellow Australians benefit from or even want our guilt, but they do want our support and our understanding, and a big chunk of that is just in sort of searching out the truth. In terms of the, sorry, I can see Jen, but the fellow with Jen, what's your name, mate?
Hugh.
Hey, Hugh. Really good questions. In terms of legislation, I could rattle off a dozen off the top of my head legislative things that states and territories should do and the Commonwealth government should do around legislating support for community controlled services, legislating against or away mandatory detention for like the 3 strikes kind of policies in Northern Territory and Western Australia, which see people locked up for unpaid parking tickets. There's a whole heap of things that are really small but have an outsized impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Another legislative change that every single jurisdiction could make in the country that would have a huge impact would be to raise the age of criminal responsibility. I say this just as one example, but does anyone know what the age of criminal responsibility is in Australia?
14.
14 is the international average.
10.
10. It's 10.
10.
Yeah, I'm in an amnesty group as well, and we've had a big campaign about that as part of the same thing, raising the age, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of it.
That's right, Claire. And that's, Amnesty have been a great, a leading advocacy org on that issue. 10 is the age of criminal responsibility in Australia. The international average is 14, and the psychological social recommendation is 16. So we are 6 years behind the recommendation and 4 years behind the international average. So you're seeing 10-year-olds being locked up for adult crimes. And again, outsized impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I can go through every single social determinant issue. Do we know what I mean by social determinants? It's the things that lead to, so when I talk about a decade-wide gap in health expectancy, it's not the fact that you aren't receiving medical care, although that's certainly a key issue. It's the fact that you grow up in a crowded house, that you, through that crowded, we see a cycle. There's a famous kind of life cycle pattern that you see. You grow up, you're born into a house that's overcrowded, and it doesn't matter what ethnicity, what country you live in. If you don't have adequate housing, doesn't matter what colour skin you are, it's very hard to maintain the hygiene levels in that house. Kids grow up in that kind of condition. They start getting ear conditions, glue ear. By the time they hit primary school, they're 18 months behind in terms of their audio kind of hearing to kids, non-Indigenous kids the same age. We know that, again, doesn't matter what nationality or ethnicity you are, if you can't hear at school, every kid on the planet will start mucking up in school because they can't engage, because they can't hear. We know that those same kids, by the time they're in later primary school, They've matriculated from, you know, just mucking up in class to actually doing stupid things, you know, petty crime. They end up then moving into youth incarceration, youth detention, and then they matriculate from there into adult detention. They're in and out of jail. When they're out of jail, they're having children that grow up in overcrowded housing, and then that cycle starts again. And that is social determinants in a negative sense. So there's legislation across the board that can address housing, education, and a whole range of issues that the states and territories have power over, that we can be and should be advocating and putting pressure on, like raising the age, for example. So that's just on the social determinants things, but at a, I guess, a macro level around, it's beyond legislation. It's really the constitutional kind of reforms that I think need to take place. Firstly, around the race powers. The only time where race powers have been enacted have been against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and most prominently to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act. So they used the race powers in the Constitution to suspend protections against racism, so that they could, the Howard government could pursue the Northern Territory intervention in 2008. So they did that so that they could suspend native title. They could enact things that would be challenged otherwise under legislation through the Racial Discrimination Act. And we know under the Abbott government, they've tried to water down further the Racial Discrimination Act. So that's where advocacy from community groups like ours is so important, to protect the existing rights and to build on those rights and make sure that they're not watering down further and using inappropriately the protections that we've fought so hard to win. So, sorry, Hugh, I could go on for hours on that one, but that's just some examples of the kind of constitutional changes, and then on top of that, legislative changes we need to make.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you.
Yeah. Paul, to my memory, the sorry statement that Rudd made in 2007, or whatever it was probably the only defining moment where I felt Australia actually got involved in doing something. Like we have all the other millions and billions of dollars we put into Aboriginal things, but there's no heart behind it. My friends, I'm in my 70s, but they come from all different, they're mainly professional people, but they haven't got a heart for the Aboriginal. And I've got some who don't consider them to be fully human. There is a real deep-seated racism. And if I can just sum up, have you any idea? Because to my mind, it's a block in the Liberal Party, Liberal Country Party, that is stopping any legislation getting to a head. And you must have done some research. Are there any way we can highlight these people and show that really they're the ones that have got changed? It's ideological. It's not even real. It's just in people's minds that you're not going to do this because they're Aborigines. Now, I'm probably coming on a bit strong passionately, but that's the way I see it. And, you know, the Labor Party's not really pulling its weight, but at least I think if they were given the opportunity, they back it. And of course the Greens will, but it's essentially a political thing. It's not going to happen while we've got these, the same as climate change. It's just got this negative block. It's just not going to happen. And how do you see it? Like, do you see any light in the horizon?
Yeah, again, thank you, Paul. That's it's a big question. So I always, and it's probably self-preservation, but it's also true, and it's healthy to do this, to take the long arc of history. So we've been, European colonisation started 230 years ago. Well, it's 230 plus years ago. Obviously, the impact of that colonisation has been huge, and we're seeing it play out, 230 years later. But in 1901, when we federated, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't recognised in the Constitution. The only place where they were mentioned was divvying up which government, and it was the states and territories at the time that had authority to legislate for them. They didn't have to count them for the purposes of voting, and therefore the census, until the constitutional change and the switch of authority from the states to the Commonwealth in 1967. So 67 was a monumental change. Now, it wasn't quite the change that we probably think it was, but by the standards of the day, 90% of Australia and non-Indigenous Australia overwhelmingly supported addressing that wrong. I'm probably a little bit younger than yourself, Paul, but I know my parents and my grandparents' experience. Their education about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history was non-existent. I guess by the time my parents were in school, the little bit of discussion about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, because history started in 1788, certainly Australian history started, but when you talked about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, it was very paternalistic, and it was sort of, you know, a very simple civilization. You know, it was terra nullius, it was nomadic lifestyles, very paternalistic attitudes. By my education, it was starting to improve, or I've still got memories of very little discussion about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. It was still very much 1788 and beyond. My little niece and nephew now have the opportunity to learn language. You know, Ngunnawal language down in Canberra, or Wiradjuri language up here in Sydney, and different languages around the country. They learn the good and the bad of Australian history and the 60,000 plus years of history before we got to 1788. And it's really that education and storytelling that I have the most hope in. And we wouldn't be at this point unless we'd had the positive milestones throughout the last 100 years. So at the moment, you can look at the statistics and see 3% of the population, but, you know, nearly, in some jurisdictions, 50% of the incarcerated population, decades of gap between life expectancy, and you think, well, where are we at? But we actually have seen marked improvement and changes, and the fact that we can get to 1992 and our High Court, the highest court in the land, can recognise native title, that wouldn't have been possible in 1932. So we are making gains and making progress. And I think the reactions that we see, and you mentioned the coalition government and particularly the Liberal, the very conservative rump of the Liberal national parties, they're so vociferous because I think they can see that they are falling. There's a widening gap between them and mainstream Australia. 50 years ago, they were maybe not mainstream Australia, but that's kind of where they're stuck. Whereas after the Uluru Statement was delivered in May 2017, within a few months there'd been some polling on Australians' attitudes to the Uluru Statement, and without any bipartisan support for that statement, and with the government of the day rejecting it, 60% of Australians still supported the Uluru Statement without really even understanding what it was. So that, for me, indicates that there's this broad, even though it might be a shallow level of understanding, there's broad support for a fair go. You know, we have these myths about, you know, Australia's values of a fair go and mateship. Well, in this case, we actually do see that our values and our priorities are changing, and that there is broad support for these things, even if our understanding is fairly shallow. So that gives me hope. 50 years ago, we didn't have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our parliaments. Now there's dozens of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parliamentarians around the country, including 4 or 5 of them in our federal parliament. So we know that there's Senator Patrick Dodson, Senator Malandiri McCarthy, our first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander minister and Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs, Ken Wyatt, and we've got Linda Burney, who's our first female Aboriginal woman. I think all women are female, aren't they? Elected to the House of Representatives. So another historic thing to happen in the last 10 years. So the arc of history is moving in the right direction, which gives me hope. And I think the reaction that we're seeing from those really ideological conservatives is because they can see that the writing's on the wall. You know, the states and territories are moving ahead with treaty, regardless of what's happening at the Commonwealth level. And the worm will turn. The tide is turning, and that's where I have hope. And I think it's always important to sort of leave that message, because we need to be redoubling our efforts. It's not fighting against the tide, it's actually moving with the tide, and we've just got to give it that final big push.
Okay.
Can I say one thing to Paul? I'm reading a really good book at the moment, Bruce Pascoe's The Dark Emu book. Maybe some of the people you were speaking to don't want to invest that sort of time in that, but it's a really good book. And some of the people in the group have said they've actually bought multiple copies to give as presents to people.
Yeah, great, Jen. It's an awesome book. One quick plug, ANTaR has an online bookstore. We're doing another bit of a sale for Rec Week this week, and we'll share the links. We've got Dark Emu. Another great book by a non-Indigenous academic is Bill Gamage. Some might have read Bill's work previously, but he wrote a very excellent companion book to Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu called The Biggest Estate on Earth. And I read it over it's been around for a number of years, but I read it over the summer as I'm driving up to visit my family in Queensland and looking at the devastation of the bushfires. And you read Bill's work and Bruce's work and the millennia of cultural understanding about how to manage our environment through fire management that had been discovered for over millennia and eons of time. It's amazing how much we've lost in the last 200 years, but we're rediscovering it. And actually, sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant. You've got me started, Jen, but we just put in a submission, ANTaR put in a submission to the New South Wales bushfire independent inquiry, which was, I think it closed yesterday. So we highlighted the fact that inquiry needs to engage with Aboriginal people about their views, that it needs to consider traditional bushfire management, and that it must consider how Aboriginal communities are impacted by bushfires, because they're often the most vulnerable communities. So we might share that submission with you guys to have a look as well. But,
wonderful.
have a look at our bookstore, and please come and buy books from us. That's another way of supporting us. Sorry, Claire.
So this is Claire. I'd just like to say, with the Dark Emu, there's also a children's version of that available, which is really good. And on a positive note, when we did the Amnesty campaign about raise the age of incarceration, the plan was children made kites, and they wrote messages for children in detention. And I think the next generation has got such a positive attitude. And a lot of them wrote, I'd hate to be away from my family and friends. And one little girl wrote, stop this nonsense at once.
Yeah. From the mouth of babes.
Exactly, yeah.
We've got the young Dark Emu available in our bookstore as well.
Oh,
If you're looking for gifts, come find it, But yeah, that's a great point, Claire. And I guess going back to Paul's question, it's decades long, like the treaty processes, but the kids that are learning language and getting a far more balanced and real education about our true history, they're going to be voting in 15 years' time, and that has an impact. Of course, we have to wait, but that's part of the tide, and that longer kind of view of history and how things are moving and what direction it's in.
Could I just say, what's coming out of this for me is, firstly, and I suppose it's through you, Phil, initially, that we communicate, but I can think of, without overloading you, I can think of sharing some websites, some book lists, some movie video lists, like there's an interactive map from the University of Newcastle, I think, where you can go in and have a very concise read, Phil, of the wars. But I can see one of the first things coming out of this is via some of the resources of ANTaR and elsewhere, of communicating to you as a group giving you some of these links, basically, these addresses. Would that be a good idea?
Oh, fantastic. Yep.
Two books.
I'd love more conversations with you too. Yeah.
2 books to quickly jot down, Phil, and you'll find them on our website. And yeah, Sheila and I will send the links. The History Wars by Henry Reynolds. And the other one is the Sydney Wars by a guy called Stephen Gapps, a local historian here in Sydney, which talks about those first 2 decades of colonisation in Sydney and the resistance of people like Pemulwuy and others resisting that colonisation. So they're 2 good books. And the map that Sheila's talking about out of the new University of Newcastle, it's quite sobering. It actually, they've done a lot of work to map all of the massacres that have happened around Australia from 1788 right through, I think the last one was in 1932 or thereabouts. Was it the Coniston Mountain?
Coniston in the Northern Territory, yeah.
Yeah, so there's some really sobering but really important resources that you should be looking at and sharing as part of that discussion.
Right. So, Sheila, would you like to add anything further to what Paul was saying? I mean, I'm trying to think now of where we've come, and it seems to me that what we're going to do is learn a little bit more and have available links and resources. So, how else can our group sort of take this matter further? Is it at this stage just a matter of continually being aware of things?
No, I think that we've probably heard enough to start with today from Paul. I think our move ahead is one for Paul to put together immediate links for information for your group, and for you to share out in whatever your, as I understand, several groups within your Broken Bay area, the things that you do. Paul did set me to the task last year of updating databases, and that's how I got to speak with Anne Lanyon, was it?
Yep.
At a Northern Beaches local reconciliation group late last year. But I can see it being productive for me with that extending databases, and we are seeking for new groups, to have that conversation about how any of your groups might like to be part of that extended database.
Right.
That does inform ourselves and in our groups or whatever we're doing with all these various issues, whether it is the political Uluru or treaty, or whether it's justice reinvestment or close the gap or whatever it might be. But I can see it useful for me to have a further conversation with the contact people amongst your groups. Paul, do you have any comment further on, just our local rec group database extension, which is where all of this grew from? Do you have any comment on where to from here?
So I think the original plan, and why we had Sheila sort of reach out to all of our old ANTaR community-based groups and reconciliation groups, was so that we can disseminate. So it's more than just the database, but that we've got an open channel to be able to communicate out the work that's happening and to seek support. And also, as I was going around and meeting with different community groups, I was hearing of all this great work that was happening at a grassroots level that we weren't necessarily always informed of. And I just thought it'd be great if ANTaR was able to provide that platform to be able to share the great work that's going on. So one thing that Sheila and I have talked about is potentially creating a bit of a, once every 6 months newsletter that sort of just captures the things that have been going on in our communities, just to highlight things or things that we want people to make note of. and also for ANTaR to say, well, here's what the key priorities are on those national or state-based campaigns that we're working on, and this is how your communities can make a contribution or help or get involved. So that's really the idea. So Sheila's been on the phone and on the email and going and meeting groups around Sydney and New South Wales for, it was over a year now, Sheila. And we're just trying to, like I said, coming and speaking with groups to glean interest and hopefully sign you guys up to be a part of that kind of communication. And who knows where it will evolve into the future.
And see, here at Ku-ring-gai Chase, we've also got Hornsby Area Residents for Reconciliation. So we all support each other as well.
Yep. I think we've been in contact with that group.
Oh, yeah. Hornsby's in the database. Yeah.
I might say farewell. I've got another couple of calls to make. But thank you very much for your time, for letting Sheila and I join.
Thanks, Paul.
It was great speaking with you all.
Yeah,
it's been inspiring. Thank you.
Yes, we really appreciate it. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for your effort, and keep it up, because it's people like yourself and Sheila that really keep us going. Gives us some sense of direction in dealing with values that we have, and putting those values into practice. So we really appreciate that.